You're listening to the OCD Stories podcast, hosted by me, Stuart Ralph. The OCD Stories is a podcast dedicated to raising awareness and understanding around obsessive-compulsive symptoms. I do this through interviewing inspired therapists, psychologists, and people who have experienced OCD. Welcome to the OCD Stories. And welcome to episode 471 of the podcast. And in this one, I chat with Bronwyn Shroyer. Bronwyn is a licensed clinical social worker who specialises in two treatment areas, OCD and PTSD. Bronwyn has lived experience with both PTSD and OCD. So in this, we discuss her OCD story, including PTSD, the interplay between trauma and OCD, eye movement, desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR for short, inference-based CBT, inferential confusion, reality sensing, and much more. And thank you to NoCD for supporting the podcast. NoCD offers effective and convenient therapy available in the US and outside the US. To find out more about NoCD, their therapy plans, if they currently take your insurance, or to download their free app, head to go.treatmyocd.com/the OCD stories, or the link will be in the episode description. Thank you to all of our patrons for supporting our work. To sign up to our Patreon and to check out the other benefits you'll receive as a patron, please see the link in the show notes. So thank you to Bronwyn for her time and expertise. It was a real pleasure talking with her, finding out more about her story, EMDR and I-CBT. And of course, thank you to you guys for listening as always. I know I say it a lot, but it does mean a lot to me and I appreciate it. And I hope you're well. And without further ado, here is Bronwyn. Welcome to the podcast, Bronwyn.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you on. Obviously, I've, in some way I've crossed your path many times. I started yours and Katie's training for 2 years ago, nearly, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe less than that, but it's a while ago. It's really good training on I-CBT. And then obviously I had Katie on not too long ago, and you're in business with her and run the OCD training school with her. And yeah, so in some ways you feel very familiar.
Yeah, and your episode that you did with Katie was really great. She's fun, right? She's fun to talk to.
Yeah, it was a good episode. So before we get into sort of, you are a therapist. So before we get into the more therapy side of things, you are a person with lived experience as well. So yes. I invite you to share your story in as little or as much detail as you want to give.
Okay. So OCD has been a part of my world for over 30 years now. I was 15 when I got diagnosed and the first symptoms, and my OCD kind of came, it was a slow build, but it kind of came out of nowhere. I was fine. And then my mom got really sick, and the doctors thought that there was a potential that if, the diagnosis went one way, that she would only have a few months to live. And thankfully that wasn't the way that went. But that event was enough to just tip me over. And suddenly within a week, 2 weeks, I noticed my first compulsion ever, which was I had to leave a note the exact same written way in the exact same spot every day, or my mom was going to die. And that just continued to morph and change over time, as it started there, but then continued into more scrupulosity OCD and contamination themes and accidental harm types of concerns, some symmetry kinds of things too. But I began taking, a really long time to make sure doors were locked at night, windows, the skin on my hands, on the palm of my hands, was actually coming off at one point in time, just from the friction of turning doorknobs so many times. And, you're standing there and you can see it's locked, but that's not good enough for OCD. Yep. Nah, never matters. The contamination OCD, I was worried about touching anything and everything. And it wasn't necessarily that I was really worried about my own health, right? Like I didn't want to get sick because I didn't want to get my loved ones sick. There was definitely this element of I cannot lose anyone. It was very much this fear-based thing of I cannot risk losing somebody. So I didn't want to be that vector of illness to anyone in my family. So, but, like most people with contamination OCD that are washing their hands a lot, my hands were compromised that way. I don't think my hands have actually ever healed. The skin on my hands is really thin now after, 3 decades of washing my hands.
Yeah.
So OCD leaves permanent damage behind sometimes.
Yeah.
But to complicate all of that, I had, over those 30 years, I definitely racked up some criteria A trauma events in there. And I think that definitely had to play in my OCD. My OCD was able to hijack some of those things and really make me believe that, that I had to act, that hypervigilance was so high. So I was constantly balancing, and I didn't realize this for a long time, but I was constantly balancing kind of a trauma response and that OCD response throughout my life. I kind of chalked it all up to OCD. I didn't realize that I had PTSD for a long time. But I think the first time I was diagnosed with PTSD, I was in a really bad car accident, and a 15-passenger van crossed a median and slammed into my car head on. And I thankfully, didn't really leave that accident with a ton of terrible damage, which was surprising, thanks to a Honda Civic that crumpled just the right way. Thank you, Honda. But I had some damage to my eyes. So for about 3 weeks, I wasn't allowed to drive, and I had to keep my eyes covered for a few days. And the first day that I was allowed to drive, I was driving to work in a car, slipped on ice and came across my path and slammed into a building, like right in front of me. And so you can see where OCD is going to go with that, right? Like bizarre things happen. Anything is possible. You have no matter what imagined hypothetical I feed you, you need to believe it now, because who gets into 2 very similar car accidents, or the second one, an almost car accident, in that short period of time? Nobody, right? So possibility matters. Probability definitely doesn't matter. But that was the first diagnosis of PTSD. There had been some events that had led up to that. And I did get treatment for PTSD at that time. It did help me with the car accident. But there was things I just kept accumulating through my life. On the OCD front of treatment, I am thankfully the daughter of another licensed clinical social worker. So she diagnosed my OCD immediately. And for somebody my age, getting diagnosed back then immediately and getting into treatment immediately, that was not a common story. So I went into treatment right away, but of course it wasn't really a specialist treatment. It was an ERP for sure. It was a lot of talk therapy. I did medication management. We know so much more about medication management now than we did back then, and medications can be incredibly helpful. They didn't help me. I now wonder if I just wasn't on a therapeutic dose. We know that dosages now need to be higher than. So I wonder, I don't remember what my dosages were, but I've attempted medications a few times in my life, and it's never really been beneficial to me, but I've definitely seen it be beneficial for clients. So I did that for a little while, and, my OCD just kept getting worse, as it does. And then when I was an undergrad, I happened to be at a university that was doing a study on exposure and response prevention. So I was like, sign me up, I'm coming in. So I did. And I was part of a study for ERP. I had an amazing therapist. I don't even remember her last name now, but her first name was Carrie. And so she was really well-versed in ERP. Now, being an ERP therapist myself, looking back, I can see just how skilled she was. She did a great job with me. And, I was a really good student. I wanted to get all of my homework done, and she was calling and checking on me several times throughout the week. And, it was really regimented since it was a study. So it was very by the book. But remember doing all the exposures in vivo, in the clinic, and it was helpful to me in some ways. It definitely helped me with response prevention, and I learned to kind of not have to do my compulsions so much. But those doubts, they just kept the thoughts, they just always came. And eventually, I think I fell into bad behavior patterns with not really keeping up with ritual prevention, response prevention pieces. But the doubts just kept coming. And I kind of got into this place where I just accepted the fact that this was going to be my life, just constant doubts. think at my worst, I was probably compulsing either physically or mentally just about all day long. And I just kind of accepted that as my fate in life. I didn't feel like doing more ERP at that time was going to be helpful. I got into life and work and, taking time to go to therapy just didn't sound extremely happy and fun for me, which is ironic for me to say as a therapist now. But I just lived. And so I look back at my life now and I can see OCD along for the journey in every single major event of my life, wedding, birth of my children. OCD has been, graduations. OCD has just been infiltrated into all of those memories now. And I wish that I had probably gotten more help for my trauma responses again, because as I said, they kept accumulating. But I didn't until my 40s. And then there was an event that happened that sent me back to therapy. And I did finally really address all of my trauma. And that put me in a really great place. I was doing a lot better. And I never thought I would be an OCD specialist as a therapist because I was with OCD all the time. I wanted nothing to do with it. Yeah. But I kept seeing clients come into my practice with for trauma because that's what I was doing at the time. And they had OCD. And that we need more OCD specialists in the world. And so my heart just kept going out to these fellow sufferers. And I couldn't keep saying, well, I'm going to refer you out. I just felt a calling to just do the work myself. So got trained in ERP and started doing that work. And then my own personal OCD was still going, but I encountered a wonderful guy named Carl Robbins and another one named Mike Hetty. I think you've been around talking to them. And they just kind of had me come and learn I-CBT with them. And it was a group of us with lived experience that all got to kind of go through that together. And there was something about I-CBT that just fell into my brain. Just was a really good fit for me. No treatment modality is going to be 100% effective for every single person. So I think your listeners all know that one person's story is one person's story. And I-CBT for me happened to be the answer. I was subclinical within about 4 months of starting I-CBT. And that was the first time in 29 years at that point in time. It was amazing. It was amazing quiet in my mind and my body. I just never, ever expected to get to a place where I was going to have OCD be quiet. It still amazes me now, and I'm several years into recovery, and OCD now comes and goes. Not in waves anymore, though. It's just like that process. I can hear it, I can feel it start, and immediately I just dismiss it. It's no big deal to me at all. It affects me. It doesn't affect me. There's nothing that I avoid. There's nothing that if I pop into that type of reasoning, I just pull myself right out. So I-CBT was definitely a really strong and good fit for my mind and my OCD. And it's been interesting to just see all that healing after so much time. It's been quite the journey.
Yeah, sounds it. And we'll talk about I-CBT in a bit. And I guess with the, PTSD, trauma, and then OCD, and you said they kind of fed into each other, or at least the trauma into the OCD. What am I trying to ask here? How did you distinguish between the two when one was at play and the other wasn't, or maybe when they were both at play?
I didn't at the time when I was living through it, but now that this is my area of specialty in my practice. So now I really understand that interaction between OCD and PTSD. But at the time I didn't. And it was difficult, I think, probably for a lot of people to know that about themselves until somebody teaches it to you. I had an amazing trauma therapist. Her name is Jenny. And she really helped me heal that trauma in such a great way. She's also was very informed about OCD. And I think that was really important to have a therapist that understood OCD, even though wasn't what we were treating at the time. But she was aware of OCD and was able to help me through those trauma elements. But now as a therapist, I think you've had Caitlin Penciotti on OCD Stories too. Dr. Penciotti has been, and others, there are other researchers as well that have really helped, Dr. Wadsworth, others. Their work in OCD and trauma is really starting to give us more of an answer for how we start to tell that apart. And OCD and PTSD can have a lot of similarities on the surface of, kind of the behaviors that we're doing. And if you look at flashbacks, they're intrusive, right? They feel intrusive in nature. They are. If you look at obsessions and OCD, they feel intrusive because they are popping into our minds unwanted. And so those mimic each other. There's also a lot of avoidance in both PTSD and in OCD. There's safety behaviors and PTSD responses. And then there's, all these compulsions happening in OCD. So it can look different. Some of the work that Dr. Penciotti and others have done is really focused on looking at the onset of when those symptoms start. When did they come on? Did they come on after a traumatic event? Maybe not like right away, but has the trauma happened before? Is there a link in the content of those things to a traumatic event? And then what's the function underlying that particular symptom? Is it to not relive a past event, or is it to try to get to a place of certainty in the moment where you're doubting? And that can help us start to take apart between OCD and PTSD. I guess I should also say that when we talk about PTSD, that's a very defined definition by the DSM or the I-CBT. And we're talking about very specific criteria, events there. My own personal take on trauma is that the DSM's criteria is very small, and that's for good reason, so that in research, we are looking at the same things. And I think that is important. But I do think that there is room, and for anyone listening, I think it's important that you know that there are events, adverse life experiences in our lives that can give a PTSD-like response to them. So it's important to talk that out with therapists and really have assessments done on kind of the symptoms that are also coming along with some of those things and see if they seem trauma-related.
Yeah. And that's obviously complex PTSD comes in as well, right?
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Feels in some of that gray area that PTSD doesn't have.
Right.
Okay. So, thank you for that. And I guess it's one of those things that at the time you didn't know, and it's that we don't know what we don't know, what we don't know. I can't remember how the saying goes, but it's that whole, and then until someone really points it out to us and explains it, then we can see it and then we can change it.
Yeah.
It's tough. Okay, so let's actually, before I go into I-CBT, I'll just ask maybe one more around trauma, specifically EMDR, because you're EMDR trained, right?
I am, yeah.
And so I guess EMDR is not, I don't think I've ever done a dedicated episode on it. It's been talked about plenty of times, but there's never been a dedicated episode. So
let's chat about it.
Yeah, exactly. So, what is it for those listening and aren't familiar? And I guess, how is it useful for trauma, and then even alongside OCD maybe?
Okay. EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And EMDR is really, it's a memory therapy. I mean, we're looking at the memories that we hold in our mind over terms of our life. And if they're stored with, we would say, maladaptive material attached to them. So things like negative cognitions, emotions, physical sensations that can come up when you start to think about that memory, like we see in PTSD. Then what we do with EMDR, I personally feel like EMDR is another exposure therapy. You are pulling up that memory and you're looking at it. The piece that people get a little confused by or trying to understand is the bilateral stimulation piece, where somebody's following your therapist's fingers back and forth, or they're tapping. And there's different theories behind what is going on with bilateral stimulation, otherwise called BLS. Why does that help? What's the purpose of it? And we don't have a solid, complete answer there. Probably the biggest theory behind BLS and adding it, one is that it helps keep dual awareness. So if somebody is dissociative, is it potentially helping them stay with that content in the here and now? Does it keep them in the here and now so they aren't dissociating out, so they can keep the material of the trauma in their mind? But probably the theory that stands out the most to me on BLS is working memory taxation, meaning We all have a short-term memory, what we're holding in our mind. Try to remember a phone number, for instance. And what you're holding there can only hold so much material. So the thought is that if we pull up an image that we're trying to get the distress off of, and you're also having your body do other things, the mind has to let go of something. So does it let go of the vividness and the emotionality associated with those trauma memories? So to me, EMDR is just it's an evidence-based treatment for PTSD, alongside cognitive processing therapy and prolonged exposure, which are totally go-to therapies for PTSD as well, and excellent therapies for it. I like EMDR because it's a little flexible, and it just works well with me as a therapist and who I am. But prolonged exposure and CPT are amazing. So is written exposure therapy. It's kind of an offshoot of CPT. So there's many different therapy options for PTSD, which is fantastic. EMDR and trauma. I do a lot of EMDR with clients. So EMDR can be a really nice way of titrating that therapy for clients so that they don't feel overwhelmed by the material. They still get into the material, still gets addressed, but you can do it at a kind of a slow pace. There isn't any homework with EMDR, which is different than something like CPT, which again, everybody's going to respond to different modalities and sometimes multiple modalities, but that can be a nice element for people who don't want to have to write and do other homeworky type things. But for people who love to write, then CPT could be a great thing if you're doing the narrative. So all of these treatments are really great treatments for PTSD. EMDR and OCD, there is not a strong evidence base for EMDR with OCD. There would need to be a lot more research there. There's the potential that maybe doing imaginal exposures through EMDR, that might be a way to do some imaginal exposures. But EMDR's research for OCD is mostly in small case studies. There's some case series. There's a couple of RCTs, but with small sample sizes. And ultimately, a lot of those involve having ERP added into the treatment. So it's difficult to tell, what's actually doing the work there. So I don't use EMDR to treat OCD, but within OCD and PTSD, I use EMDR all the time to treat the actual trauma pieces that OCD is then able to hijack into its own content. So sometimes it's moving back and forth between ERP and EMDR, or I-CBT and EMDR, or sticking with EMDR for a while and getting the trauma down and then coming to OCD treatment, or vice versa.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's a really good explanation of EMDR. And you kind of you called EMDR basically an exposure therapy, which I feel it is too. But that's some of the criticism it gets, right? Is it's working because it's exposure. It's not necessarily working because of the bilateral stimulation. But obviously you do EMDR instead of prolonged exposure. So I assume you buy into and believe into bilateral stimulation. And I'm not against it because I don't know enough. But
I don't know. Really, I'm not sure about bilateral stimulation. Like, I'm going to stay with where the research is. We don't know exactly what it's doing. Is it doing something? Maybe. But we also know that exposure therapy without bilateral stimulation works just fine. I think that the reason that EMDR appeals to me so much is just how it's like a dance with your client. It's much more, it's fluid, and I like the ability to titrate things. I like that clients are able to just go with their thought process and their brain just starts to do what it needs to do. So as you're doing those sets, just so if no one's gone through EMDR that's listening, you are asked by your therapist to bring up an image, and then you link what's the negative cognition to that. What do you want to believe about yourself in relation to that memory? How much do you believe that? What are the emotions associated with that memory? What's the body sensations associated with that memory? What's the unit of distress number for that memory? That's kind of how we start EMDR. Then you're asked to hold that image and the negative cognition, and you start to do those sets. So either tapping, eye movements. With kids, I can have them draw across a piece of paper back and forth a bunch of times. There's tappers that people use. I do think that the BLS like in my mind, and having been a client that did EMDR, one of the things I liked about doing the BLS was that it helped me feel like I was driving that process in some way, like physically doing something as my mind was doing its work. So we don't know the science behind BLS yet, but could it potentially add something to the treatment? Sure, it could. So I don't feel qualified to say if it does or doesn't. But do I find that EMDR is effective? Yes, very much so.
Yeah, good. Yeah, good explanation. And it's nice to hear that you're not, as we were saying before we started recording, like dogmatic about a therapy, because obviously there are EMDR therapists say, no, the bilateral stimulation is crucial and it's really important. And I agree with you. I don't know if it is or not, but there are people out there that say it is. And it's nice to hear that it works. I like doing it. Whether it's the BLS or not, it's not really important. I like doing it and it works.
I'm big in nuance. Like, I like to, following the research is always really important. And so following research, but then also continuing to have critical thinking skills and questioning things. And, I very much believe in that 3-pronged stool approach to treatment, which is making sure you have an evidence base for anything that you're offering your client, but then having client voice in there, and then also using clinical judgment. So, if I did every single treatment out there that's evidence-based for OCD and it didn't work, would I then say, okay, well, let's try some imaginal exposure through EMDR? I might. I haven't ever gotten there yet because I stay with the evidence on where we are and what clients are asking to do.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I like that. So let's talk I-CBT.
Yeah.
Actually, and last point on it, I like that you said the different other therapies for trauma, and if people like writing, CBT might be good for them, or
written exposure therapy.
Yeah, or wet. No, it's therapy. P. No, T. Sorry, wet. Yeah. I've got the manual for that. I haven't read it yet, but it looks interesting.
That's great. And if you want a quick training on it, Caleb Black does a really good one.
Oh, really?
I can send you a link.
Yeah, please do. And send it to me and I'll add it into the show notes as well for any therapists listening. But you make a good point, and I guess that's for all therapy, is there are going to be some therapies that are more effective than others for certain things, and then there are going to be others, maybe like ERP, I-CBT, that are both good, but they work better for different people, different types of people. And so we need to, I guess the individual needs to... the individual is important, I guess is what I'm saying, and everyone's brain is different. Same with like you were saying with medication. Didn't work for you, but it works for some. There's no black and whites here of something works or it doesn't.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely true. And, ERP, just as habituation will work for somebody, an ERP with inhibitory learning needs to be with somebody else, and somebody else with ERP may need ACT also informed ERP. So having that flexibility as a therapist and really learning multiple tools, I think is key, in my opinion, to really meeting the needs of the people that show up in your office.
Oh yeah, I fully agree. I'm integrative by trade, so I think every therapist needs to be integrative, because we shouldn't just have one therapy. It's like, as I say, it's like being a footballer, soccer player, and just, using one foot or having one type of kick, but you need, a variety to be a really, really good player.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's my belief. I could be wrong. So I-CBT, obviously we've talked about it 3 or 4 times now on the podcast. Just for those that haven't heard of it, not really that familiar with it, inference-based therapy is I-CBT. How would you sort of explain it, or the core tenets of it?
So inference-based CBT, I-CBT, it's been around for about 30 years now. The first paper that kind of introduced this was by Dr. Kieran O'Connor and Sophie Robillard back in 1995, I think. So it's been around for a bit. And then Dr. Frederick Ardema, joined Dr. O'Connor in doing research in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, on what then became this treatment modality now. So understanding the underpinning, the mechanism of change in I-CBT is to focus in on a particular reasoning process that's creating the doubts that the person with OCD gets. So that concept is called inferential confusion. And So if you look at OCD, a person encounters a trigger in their life. It could be an internal or an external kind of prompt that then starts that OCD cycle that we're all familiar with as OCD sufferers. In I-CBT, what we would say is that when that obsession comes into the mind, we'd call that an obsessional doubt, and that's created by a different kind of reasoning than we usually use throughout our day. So normally, like there's a ceiling fan above my head right now. It's possible it could fall down on me. But if I stay with my senses and I don't have any, if I turned the fan on right now and it's not wobbling, there's not screws coming down from the ceiling, that possibility that the fan is going to follow me, it's not coming into my awareness if I just generally are walking into this room. So normal reasoning, we rely on our senses, and our senses is a broad grouping of senses here, not just your main five, but also your intentions, your desires, your common sense application of context in the moment, who you really are. We rely on all of those senses to tell us whether or not a possibility is relevant in the here and now moment that we're in. What I-CBT theorizes is that if you encounter a trigger and you have OCD, that your mind then slides into a different type of reasoning called inferential confusion, where we're over relying on possibility. We give it a lot more weight and we're willing to disregard or ignore our senses in that moment. And we use information out of context. So same story with the ceiling fan. If I came in this room and I started thinking, oh, wow, that's above my head. It's heavy. It's possible it could fall. Maybe the screws are loose. Maybe there was a small earthquake I didn't notice and they got jiggled loose somehow. And then I think about a story I heard one time about somebody, sitting in their office and the ceiling fan fell on their desk in front of them. I'm going to use all that information and I'm ignoring what my senses are telling me, which is nothing's wrong. But I can get pulled away from that sense data in the here and now and into that hypothetical imagined situation. And that's what makes OCD so convincing, because once it does that, then it sends us into the rest of the cycle. Now we're in our own personal horror movie about all these bad things that are going to happen. The anxiety spikes or disgust or shame or guilt. All of those come along, and then we have to do a compulsion. So the compulsions are the anxiety is based on the obsession forming to begin with. So I-CBT's goal is to, unlike an ERP, when we're working on the anxiety and the compulsion end of that sequence, in I-CBT, we're only going to be working on the formation of the doubt. So we're helping our clients slow things down, really look at what information did you use to come up with that doubt? Like, how is OCD convincing you to listen to it? And now let's look at what are the underpinnings of that process. You see how that doubt's created on these three concepts of over-relying on possibility, irrelevant associations, and not trusting your senses. And when that fits with somebody's mind, it's like just falls right in. Sometimes it takes a bit. Learning I-CBT can be a layered process. But I was working with a new client just yesterday that already is just 2 weeks in and it's already starting to just click. That's not always going to happen, but it's so great to see it when it does. He's already identifying, oh man, yeah, I'm totally relying on my imagination and going away from my senses. So it's a great therapy to have as a therapist, just another evidence-based tool to have. So I encourage everyone to learn that. I encourage everyone to learn ERP and ACT. All of these things are important to have.
Yeah, thank you. Really interesting. And so where ERP focuses is obviously on changing the behavior, the compulsion you've got in the OCD cycle, the intrusive thought, then the distress, then the compulsion we do. So ERP is then targeting the behaviors, the compulsions, changing those to then either habituate or learn something new. And if I'm hearing you right, I-CBT is coming in right at the start of the thought, at that kind of inferential confusion, as you said, or the inference we're making, and then trying to see that.
Yeah, so it's all about seeing that process for what it is. It's like, if you've ever seen a magician do a trick and then they reveal how they did it, you can't get tricked by it anymore. Yeah. So when we understand how OCD gets created through that inferential confusion process, and you understand why your brain, just went that way, then suddenly it's not a big deal to just say, oh, that was inferential confusion. I do not have to listen to anything that it says because I know it's made out of faulty reasoning. It's not something I have to listen to.
Yeah. I always come back to ACT and diffusion, right? And I know I had Mike Heddy on before, always great to speak with Mike. But he did raise the point of, and I don't think it really sunk in at the time. For me, it still feels very similar with ACT of diffusion. For me now, where I've used ACT, I see the thought, that's OCD. I can see what's going on here. I don't need to hook into that. So I'm not reality sensing, but in some way that process is happening for me.
Yeah.
So I still struggle to differentiate the two. And this is not challenging I-CBT. It's just, for me, they're very similar, but I get told they're not. And I'm still struggling.
Well, I struggle with ACT and metacognitive, trying to tell those apart. So that's my learning curve right now. That's my growth edge. But yeah, I mean, in metacognitive therapy and in ACT, that diffusion or detached mindfulness, you're noticing that the thought is a mental event. You're trying to get some space away from it. Yeah. I-CBT kind of takes it just one step further, and it tells you exactly why you don't have to listen to that thought. Like, think of the makeup of that thought, and here's why you don't need to listen to it. So it gives you that why. It's just a little bit deeper.
Which might make it easier to let go of if someone's got a why.
Yeah, exactly.
But, I definitely have clients that they don't say why, but you can tell that's their. But I'm like, let's practice the skill, come back to, as you say, mindful awareness. And some people just can't let go of that. So maybe, the why can help with that process of letting go.
Yeah. It's a great thing to be able to have the why. Yeah. Lots of agency once you get that place.
Yeah. Was it he who has a why can bear almost anyhow?
There you go.
Nietzsche that said that, or Frankl, one of the two. Maybe. And when you said, when you kind of see the magic trick and, you can no longer realize it's magic anymore because the illusion's been shattered. It reminded me of the other saying of when you see how the sausage is made, it's that kind of, you don't necessarily want to see how the sausage is made, but in OCD you do, because then you can, see it and know it for what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And, for people who want to learn more about I-CBT, they can go to the official website is icbt.online, and you can read about I-CBT there. Dr. Ardema also has a new self-help book that came out called Resolving OCD. The first volume's out right now. The second one, I think he's currently writing. So that's another way for some people to learn about I-CBT. There's lots of videos on YouTube and things like that too. But yeah, I'm always going to be a proponent or an advocate for people, for people with OCD to learn about the different modalities out there and kind of have a more informed sense when they are looking for a therapist or going into therapy. And also keep in mind that your first choice when you try it, it may not be the one that ends up helping you, but then also stay open to all the other ones. Don't ever think, oh, that's that evidence-based treatment over there, that's never going to work for me, because it might be. So if I-CBT appeals to you right now and you go to treatment and maybe it's not, but you've kind of shut out ERP or medication, like, don't do that. Like, stay open to all of these. Same with reverse. If you've done ERP for years and you're kind of gung-ho about it, but things are still kind of hanging on, go try I-CBT and see if it takes care of what's left over for you. It's great that we have options now.
Oh, 100%. And the client, I was mentioning about therapists integrating therapies. The client can integrate learnings from therapies. So if they do I-CBT, if it helps them, awesome. If it doesn't, they're still going to learn stuff that they can then bring into ACT, ERP, metacognitive, whatever, and vice versa.
Yeah, exactly.
We learn, and even just amongst I-CBT therapists or ERP therapists, you'll learn different things too, because they'll explain it in different ways that might sink in for you.
It's one of the reasons I love doing training with the OCD training school, because I have Gina Abundante and Katie Merritt with me, and all three of us explain things just a little differently. But that's great because everybody's learning is a little different, right? Their learning style. So some metaphor I use may really hit with somebody, and then the next unit that we're teaching in our training, Katie or Gina may say something that really hits home with a different learner. And it is a valued thing to hear things multiple times and hear it from different people. That's a really good point.
Yeah, 100%. So I'm just actually, question on I-CBT, because it's basically built as a therapy for OCD.
Correct.
Which I think is actually quite unique, because most other therapies, ERP is used for pretty much anything anxiety or phobic. ACT is used for everything, pretty much, rightly or wrongly. And but yeah, ICBT seems to be just for OCD. But I guess my question was, think of generalized anxiety, social anxiety. Surely ICBT should work for those too. To a point.
What Dr. Artemo would say to us if he was here is that ICBT treats inferential confusion. So if something is coming out of inferential confusion, then ICBT is going to be applicable to that condition, that symptom in that moment. What we see with generalized anxiety disorder is that often it is built on something that is uncertain. Climate change, gun violence here in the United States, anything that's political out there in the world right now. All of it feels really uncertain. And so the anxiety that we have around that, there really isn't sense data in the moment that we could rely on to resolve those worries, right? So there's a difference between doubt through an ICBT lens that's coming through inferential confusion versus true uncertainty in worry or anxiety. So ICBT wouldn't be applied to those. And in my practice, I lean more towards ACT when I'm dealing with that values-based exposure type stuff of continuing to live your life and not avoid and all of those things. And it is about tolerating uncertainty. But ICBT would say and strongly say that within OCD treatment, we do not have to tolerate uncertainty, that we can get back to certainty from our senses in that moment in time. So when people think of OCD as more general, like that maybe generalized anxiety kind of fits in with OCD, ICBT would fight back with that because there would be some true uncertainty there that people are dealing with and an overestimation of threat.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I guess, but for social anxiety, you can still have that overestimation of threat, but I guess that's where, Frederick would say, maybe the ICBT would work then if there is that inferential doubt.
Right. You have to figure out
for some social anxiety, there is genuine uncertainty.
Right. Got to figure out where's what's underneath it driving the social anxiety, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Which makes me think you can almost, by ICBT standards, you could completely rename OCD to being like inferential doubt disorder or,
Exactly.
Yeah. Anyway, that's for some brainier people than myself to figure that one out. Someone with plenty of time on their hands. So is there anything for a client going into ICBT, is there anything they should go into that therapy with? Like with ERP, we might say go in willing to do home practice, willing to do your best to face the fears gradually. Have that kind of readiness mindset. You got to be willing, blah, 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 blah. Is there anything with ICBT that can help going into ICBT therapy?
Yeah, I mean, I think across the board with therapy modalities is that readiness piece. Like, are you willing to kind of sit back and admit to yourself that something might help? OCD always has that hypervigilance element to it. If you get rid of me, like if you hear OCD's voice, if you get rid of me, you're going to be unsafe. So are you willing to kind of step in and challenge that belief? What in metacognitive therapy, we call that a positive metacognitive belief, that of the function, the worthiness of hypervigilance that OCD might bring. So that is a piece of that. And then I would also say that if you've done ERP in the past and you've learned some things, you're going to unlearn some of that in ICBT just because it's a different theoretical model. So a willingness to see your OCD through a different kind of lens is also going to be something that might be needed with ICBT. ICBT doesn't have behavioral practice with it. So there isn't exposure involved here, but there is, working through the cognitive side of stuff of, slowing things down, practicing writing out sequences, practicing writing out OCD narratives. So there are some homework things oriented with ICBT, just like there is going to be with ERP and tracking and all kinds of things there. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So, is there anything else you want to say on ICBT before I kind of change lanes?
No, I mean, I'm just grateful that it exists. Really, that's been a great thing. Yeah.
The more therapies, the better.
Yeah.
Until we get one that works 100% of the time every time.
That'd be great.
Then we just need that one. But yeah. Cool. So you can pick up the phone, call the 20-year-old Bronwyn. What do you tell her?
20-year-old Bronwyn. Well, I would tell her that Jenny is in your future. So that's good. My therapist that helped me with the trauma. But I would also tell her, when I was 20, that was right around the time when Dr. O'Connor he had just come up with inferential confusion. He had just realized his insights into OCD. So I would tell her, look, there's this guy who's about to change things for you. And there's another one that's going to join him that's going to help change things for you. You just got to hang on until it comes your way.
Yeah. Awesome. And Kieran was British as well, so that
he
makes me
was
happy. So you got a billboard? What do you want written on that billboard?
There are so many things you could write on a billboard right now. If I wanted to do one that was OCD oriented, but maybe might lean into some other things that I'd like to get across the world, it would be, the world is full of misinformation and to really filter your sources. And that definitely includes OCD. Yeah. But filter your sources.
True. Yeah, I like that. And lastly, is there anything else you wish you could have said or shared today?
I just, two things probably. One is, and this is something I plug all the time when someone says, is there anything else you want to share? But for those of you who are parents maybe listening to this and you have multiple children and one of them or more have OCD and then you have some that don't, I want you to just remember those siblings. As the person in my family with OCD, I think back to my siblings and just kind of how much they probably had to deal with growing up with me. And I know that they know that none of that was my fault. But, I definitely needed something in those moments from my parents and often from my siblings. And I know that my OCD impacted them. So just take moments with your child that doesn't have OCD, not as a punishment to the one that does, definitely not that, but also just remember that they're also living with OCD. So that's just something that I like to say. And then the other thing is that, for those of you who are out there dealing with OCD and PTSD, do not give up hope for a second. We have so many great therapy modalities now. It's truly about finding the right mix for you and finding a therapist that understands both OCD and PTSD. It can be difficult to find an OCD specialist on your, like just with that, but finding a specialist that truly specializes. So this means you go on their webpage and they don't have 50 things listed. It's OCD and PTSD and maybe 2 other little things, but you really want somebody that you can find that's a specialist if you can find them. And this is my passion is helping people learn, therapist wise, helping them learn the importance of understanding this particular co-occurrence. There's other co-occurrences out there that are just as important, that I just am not in that advocacy space, but I am here. And that has been my passion, is making sure as many clients or clinicians as possible that come to me for EMDR consultation, I would love to turn them into OCD specialists as well. Or when people are coming to me for OCD consultation, especially I-CBT consultation, my consultees that are listening to this are probably like, yeah, she talks about trauma a lot. Like there's an importance of understanding that. Not that every single OCD sufferer is going to have PTSD. That's not true. We also can't cure OCD by dealing with PTSD. You don't treat trauma and have OCD go away, even if it onsetted with trauma. They're 2 different processes. You can't treat OCD and make PTSD go away, even though it may exacerbate those symptoms. They need different treatments. So you need to find somebody that knows what they're doing. And if you're a therapist listening and you've thought about, hey, I really would like to work with trauma, or I really would like to work with OCD, do it. Go get trained, learn it really well, and then benefit your clients' lives, because the ripple effects that go out from doing that kind of work is huge.
Yeah. Good point. Good points. Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you today, and I appreciate your insight and your story.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. And thank you to our Patreons who helped make this episode possible. And if you would like to find out more about Patreon and the rewards and benefits, then there will be a link in the episode description. If you enjoy the OCD Stories podcast and would like to support us, please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to the podcast. And thank you to NoCD for supporting our work. And if you want to find out more about NoCD, head to go.treatmyocd.com/the OCD Stories or click the link in the episode description. And quick disclaimer, guys, this podcast is not therapy. It is not a replacement for therapy. Please seek treatment from a trained professional. And until we speak, Take care.